Imagine a world where the air is thick with the smoke of war, where the clash of steel and the cries of the desperate echo through muddy fields and crumbling towns. It's the early 15th century, and France is a fractured land, torn apart by a century of conflict with England. The 100 Years' War has bled the nation dry, leaving villages in ashes and hope in tatters. Into this chaos steps a figure who seems to defy the very laws of history, a teenage peasant girl named Joan of Arc, armed with nothing but a vision and an unshakable belief that she's been chosen by God to save her people. Her story is one of courage, faith, and ultimately, betrayal. But today, we're not here to retell Joan's tale. No, we're diving deeper into the shadows cast by her blazing light. We're here to uncover the gruesome fate of those who betrayed her, those who turned their backs on a girl who dared to change the course of a nation. What drove them to such treachery? And what price did they pay when the wheel of history turned against them? Let's step back to 1429. France is a chessboard, and the pieces are moving fast. The English, allied with the Burgundians, a powerful French faction, hold vast swaths of the country, including the city of Orleans, a key to controlling the Loire Valley. The French crown, under the weak and wavering Charles VII, is on the verge of collapse. Enter Joan, a 17-year-old from the village of Domremy, claiming divine guidance. She's no warrior, no noble, no scholar, just a girl with a fire in her eyes and a voice that somehow convinces men to follow her. Against all odds, she rallies the French forces, leads them to a stunning victory at Orleans, and paves the way for Charles' coronation at Reims. For a moment, it seems the tide has turned. Joan is a miracle, a saint in the making, a symbol of hope for a broken nation. But miracles don't last in a world ruled by power and greed. Joan's rise threatens to many English lords who see her as a witch, Burgundian nobles who resent her influence, and even French courtiers who whisper that a peasant girl has no place in their Game of Thrones. By 1430, her enemies are closing in. At Compiègne, a town loyal to Charles, Joan leads a sortie against Burgundian forces. It's a desperate fight, and in the chaos, she's captured not by the English, but by a Burgundian soldier, a man named Lionel de Wandam. This moment is the spark that lights the fuse of her downfall. Wandam hands her over to his lord, Jean de Luxembourg, who in turn sells her to the English for 10,000 livres, a fortune at the time. The betrayal is complete, and Joan, the Maid of Orleans, is now a prisoner. Her fate sealed by men who saw her not as a savior, but as a pawn to be traded. Who were these men, these betrayers? Let's start with Jean de Luxembourg, a nobleman whose loyalty was as flexible as the wind. A Burgundian vassal, he owed allegiance to Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, a man who'd aligned himself with the English to carve out his own power in France. Luxembourg wasn't a monster in the cartoonish sense, no twirling mustache or sinister laugh. He was a pragmatist, a man of his time, who saw war as a business and captives as currency. Joan wasn't the first prisoner he'd ransomed, nor would she be the last, but her case was different. She wasn't just a soldier or a noble. She was a symbol, a lightning rod for French resistance. To hand her over was to snuff out that spark, to ensure the English could crush her spirit, and with it, France's hope. Did Luxembourg hesitate? Did he lie awake at night, wondering if he'd crossed a line? We have no record of his thoughts, but we know his actions. He took the gold, and Joan was sent to Rouen, to a trial that was less about justice than it was about destruction. Then there's Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a man whose name would become synonymous with betrayal. Cauchon was no mere churchman. He was a political animal, a Burgundian loyalist who'd climbed the ranks by aligning himself with the English cause. When Joan was captured, Cauchon saw an opportunity, not just to eliminate a threat, but to cement his own power. He orchestrated her trial, a sham dressed up as a theological inquisition. The charges: heresy, witchcraft, even cross-dressing, because Joan dared to wear men's armor in battle. Cauchon stacked the court with his allies, manipulated witnesses, and twisted Joan's words to paint her as a blasphemer. Picture him in his bishop's robes, his face a mask of piety, as he questioned a girl who'd never learned to read but could outwit scholars with her faith and courage. Did he believe his own accusations, or was he just playing a role? The records suggest a man consumed by ambition, willing to sacrifice truth for power. Joan's conviction was his triumph, her death, his legacy. But the betrayers weren't only those who held the chains. Consider Charles VII, the king Joan had crowned. Where was he when she was captured? Why didn't he ransom her, as was common for valuable prisoners? Charles owed his throne to Joan, yet he lifted not a finger to save her. Was it cowardice, ingratitude, or something colder, fear that her growing legend threatened his own authority? Charles was a man who preferred compromise to conflict, a king who'd rather negotiate with enemies than fight for his own. Joan's captor was inconvenient, her trial a distraction. By staying silent, he betrayed her as surely as those who sold her. His inaction speaks volumes, a reminder that power often breeds apathy in those who wield it. Now, let's pause not to break the story, but to step into the mind of Joan herself. Chained in a damp cell in Rouen, Imagine the weight of it. A girl who'd seen visions of saints, who'd led armies, now alone, surrounded by men who mocked her, questioned her, tried to break her. The trial lasted months, from January to May 1431. Day after day, she faced Cochin and his panel, her words recorded by scribes who twisted them into traps. She was 19, illiterate, yet she held her own, answering with a clarity that unnerved her accusers. "Do you believe you are in a state of grace?" they asked, a theological landmine. "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there," she replied. Even now, centuries later, her words cut through the fog of history, sharp and unyielding, but the strain was immense. At one point, exhausted and threatened with torture, she recanted, agreeing to wear women's clothes and submit only to retract her confession, days later, choosing death over dishonor. On May 30, 1431, she was led to the stake in Rouan's marketplace, tied to a pillar, and burned alive. The flames consumed her body, but her spirit, that was something her betrayers could never touch. What drives a person to betray someone like Joan? Was it greed, as with Luxembourg, ambition, as with Cochin, or something more human, fear of a world where a peasant girl could challenge the order of things? Joan's betrayers weren't just individuals. They were products of a system, a world where power was a zero-sum game, and loyalty was a luxury few could afford. The 100 Years' War had hardened hearts, turned neighbors into enemies, and made survival a daily calculation. To betray Joan was to choose safety, status, or survival over a girl who seemed to belong to another realm of faith and miracles that felt dangerous, even heretical, to those rooted in the here and now. But history has a way of balancing the scales. Let's follow the threads of these betrayers' lives to see what became of them when the fire of Joan's legacy burned brighter than they could have imagined. Start with Jean de Luxembourg. He'd pocketed his 10,000 livres, a tidy sum for a nobleman with lands to maintain and wars to fight. But wealth doesn't buy peace. Luxembourg lived only a decade longer, dying in 1440 at the age of 50. His role in Joan's capture didn't bring him glory. It faded into the background of his career, a footnote in a life spent navigating the treacherous politics of Burgundy. Did he ever reflect on the girl he'd sold? Did her name haunt him as France began to rally, as her death inspired others to take up her cause? We can't know, but we do know that his wealth and titles couldn't shield him from the shifting tides of war. By the time he died, the French were gaining ground, and the Burgundian alliance with England was fraying. His betrayal, in the end, bought him nothing lasting. Pierre Cochin's fate is more dramatic, and perhaps more fitting. After Joan's execution, he continued to serve the English, basking in his role as a loyal bishop. But the winds of fortune are fickle. By 1435, the Burgundians, under Philip the Good, began to reconcile with Charles VII, signing the Treaty of Arras and abandoning their English allies. Cochin, ever the opportunist, tried to pivot, seeking favor with the French crown. It didn't work. His role in Joan's trial had made him a pariah in a France increasingly united under Charles. In 1442, he died suddenly in Rouen, the same city where he'd condemned Joan. Some whispered of poison, others of divine justice. The truth is likely more mundane, a heart attack or illness, but the timing feels almost poetic. Cochin's legacy was tied to Joan's death, and as her legend grew, his name became a byword for treachery. The man who'd sought power through her destruction found himself erased by her enduring light. And what of Charles VII? The king who'd abandoned Joan lived to see his crown secured, but at what cost? By the 1450s, France had expelled the English from most of its territories, a victory Joan had set in motion. In 1456, Charles, perhaps stung by guilt or pressured by her growing cult, ordered a posthumous retrial. The verdict was unanimous. Joan was innocent, her trial a miscarriage of justice. She was declared a martyr, and later, in 1920, a saint. Charles' reign was a success, but his silence during Joan's ordeal left a stain. History remembers him not as the king who saved France, but as the man who owed his throne to a girl he failed to save. His betrayal was passive, but no less profound. As we trace these fates, a question lingers. What does it mean to betray someone like Joan? It's not just about the act itself, the selling, the condemning, the abandoning. It's about what that act reveals about the human heart, about the choices we make when power, fear, or ambition cloud our vision. Joan's betrayers weren't monsters. They were men of their time, shaped by a brutal world. Yet their choices had consequences, not just for Joan, but for themselves. Their names are tied to hers, not in glory, but in shame. And that's the paradox of betrayal. It promises gain, but often delivers loss. Let's linger on the scene of Joan's execution, because it's here that the weight of their actions comes into focus. Picture the marketplace in Rouen, crowded with soldiers, priests, and townsfolk. The air is heavy with the smell of smoke and fear. Joan, tied to the stake, asks for a cross, and a soldier makes one from 2 sticks, pressing it into her hands. As the flames rise, she calls out to Jesus, her voice steady even as her body burns. Some in the crowd weep, others turn away. An English soldier, hardened by years of war, mutters that they've burned a saint. Even in death, Joan's power is undeniable. She forces those around her to confront their own humanity, their own complicity. For her betrayers, that moment must have been a reckoning, whether they admitted it or not. To betray Joan was to betray something larger, a spark of hope, a glimpse of a world where faith could move mountains. But the story doesn't end with the flames. Joan's death was a turning point, a catalyst that shifted the course of the war. Her execution galvanized the French, turning a peasant girl into a martyr whose name inspired armies. By 1453, the English were driven from France, save for a toehold in Calais. The 100 Years' War was over, and Joan's vision united France under a crowned king had come to pass. Her betrayers, though, didn't live to see the full scope of their failure. Luxembourg was dead, Cauchin disgraced, Charles haunted by his own inaction. Their fates remind us that history isn't just about the victors, it's about the choices that shape who we become. As the ashes of Joan's pyre settled in Rouen marketplace, the world didn't pause. The war ground on, swords clashed, and the men who'd orchestrated her death moved forward, believing they'd snuffed out a threat. But history is a relentless judge, and the consequences of their betrayal were only beginning to unfold. The fire that consumed Joan didn't extinguish her spirit. It ignited something fiercer, a legacy that would haunt her betrayers and reshape the soul of a nation. Let's walk deeper into this story, tracing the ripples of their actions, the unseen costs they paid, and the brutal truths about power and human nature that their choices laid bare. Consider the Burgundians, the faction that profited from Joan's capture. Beyond Jean de Luxembourg, men like Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, loomed large. Philip wasn't at Compiègne when Joan was taken, nor did he personally hand her over to the English. But he was the architect of the alliance that made her betrayal possible. A shrewd and ambitious leader, Philip had thrown his weight behind the English to secure his own dominance in France. His vassals, men like Luxembourg and Vendôme, acted under his banner, their loyalty bound by land, gold, and the promise of power. Philip's role in Joan's fate was indirect but undeniable. His politics created the machinery that crushed her. What did he think when he heard of her execution? Did he see it as a necessary sacrifice, a small price for his grand vision? Or did her name linger, a quiet unease in the halls of his opulent court? Philip's story doesn't end with Joan's death, but it's marked by the slow unraveling of his ambitions. By 1435, just 4 years after the execution, he began to see the limits of his English alliance. The French, emboldened by Joan's martyrdom, were rallying under Charles VII. The English, meanwhile, were overextended, their grip on France weakening. Philip, ever the pragmatist, sensed the shift. At the Treaty of Arras in 1435, he made a stunning reversal, reconciling with Charles and abandoning the English. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy, securing his lands and influence in a resurgent France, but it came too late to erase his complicity in Joan's fate. Her death had galvanized the French spirit, and Philip's belated switch couldn't undo the blood on his hands. He lived until 1467, a wealthy and powerful duke, but his legacy was tainted. History remembers him not as a unifier, but as a man who played both sides, profiting from a girl's betrayal before pivoting to save himself. Now, let's turn to the lesser figures, the men whose names are footnotes but whose actions fueled the tragedy. Take Lionel de Vendôme, the Burgundian soldier who first captured Joan at Compiègne. We know little about him, a commoner or minor knight, likely driven by the promise of reward. His role was brief but pivotal. Without his hands on the reins, Joan might have escaped. What became of him? The records are silent, but we can imagine his life. A soldier in the 100 Years' War faced constant danger, disease, battle, betrayal. By his own allies, if Vendôme survived the war, he likely returned to obscurity, his moment of infamy forgotten by all but the chroniclers. Yet his choice, however fleeting, set the stage for a chain of horrors. Did he ever learn what happened to the girl he'd seized? Did her cries at the stake echo in his dreams? For men like Vendôme, betrayal was less about ambition and more about survival, a single act in a brutal world where loyalty was a luxury. The English, too, played their part. Men like John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, the regent for the young King Henry VI, saw Joan as a dangerous anomaly. Bedford wasn't in Rouen for the trial, but he approved its outcome, ensuring the English crown's resources backed Cauchin's Inquisition. To Bedford, Joan wasn't a person. She was a problema, charismatic figure who'd turned the tide at Orleans and threatened English claims to France. Her execution was meant to break French morale, to prove that no miracle could defy English might, but Bedford miscalculated. Joan's death didn't crush the French, it inflamed them. By 1436, Bedford was dead, worn down by years of war, and the strain of holding a crumbling empire. His dream of an English France died with him, and Joan's shadow loomed large over his failure. The men who followed his orders, the guards who chained her, The executioner who lit the pyre faded into anonymity, their fates unrecorded, but their hands were stained, their lives touched by a moment of cruelty that history would not forgive. Let's step into the aftermath, the years when Joan's legacy began to take shape. Her execution wasn't the end. It was a beginning. The French, stirred by her sacrifice, found new resolve. Men and women who'd never met her took up arms, inspired by the tale of a girl who'd faced kings and armies with nothing but her conviction. By 1453, the English were driven from France, their dreams of conquest shattered. Joan's vision, a crowned king, a united nation had triumphed, not through her life, but through her death. Her betrayers, though, didn't live to see this reckoning. Most were dead or diminished, their names tied to a girl they'd tried to erase. The irony is stark. In seeking to destroy her, they ensured her immortality. But what of the psychological toll? Betrayal isn't a one-way street. It leaves scars on the betrayer as well as the betrayed. Imagine Pierre Cauchon in his final years, as the Treaty of Arras shifted alliances and France began to heal. Did he hear whispers of Joan's growing legend? Did he sense the tide turning, the judgment of history closing in? The records don't say, but we know human nature. Guilt, shame, or even denial must have shadowed him. For Cauchon, betrayal was a calculated act, but calculations don't shield the heart. The same could be true for Luxembourg, for Philip, for the countless others who played a role. Their actions were pragmatic, even routine, in the context of war. Yet Joan wasn't just another prisoner. She was a mirror, reflecting their own flaws back at them. To betray her was to confront their own capacity for cruelty, and that confrontation, however buried, leaves a mark. Let's explore the societal impact, because Joan's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a symptom of a deeper malaise. The 100 Years' War had fractured France, pitting neighbor against neighbor, noble against peasant. Loyalty was a commodity, bought and sold like grain or wine. Joan's capture and trial exposed this rot. Her enemies, English, Burgundian, even French, worked together, not out of shared belief, but out of mutual interest. Her trial was a microcosm of this fractured world, a church corrupted by politics, a king too weak to act, a people too divided to resist. Yet her death revealed something else, a hunger for unity, for meaning, for something greater than the endless cycle of war. Joan's betrayers, by silencing her, inadvertently gave voice to that hunger. Her story became a rallying cry, a reminder that even in the darkest times, one person's courage can spark change. What does this mean for us, listening to this story across centuries? It's a reminder that history isn't just about kings and battles. It's about choices, about the moments when individuals decide who they'll be. Joan's betrayers chose power, safety, or ambition, and paid a price not always in life, but in legacy. Joan chose faith, courage, and truth, and her light still burns. Their story asks us to look at our own lives, to question where we stand when power tempts or fear whispers. Do we betray the Joans in our world, those who challenge, who inspire, who dare to dream? Or do we stand with them, even when the cost is high? The answer lies in the choices we make, the crosses we fashion, the fires we refuse to let consume us.